Hello and welcome, I'm Riz Khan. The fasting month of Ramadan has started for the Muslim world, and the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza has entered its fifth month, with tensions mounting recently as even the US president is looking for some sort of concession from Israel. Where do things stand? Well, we have with us Palestinian-American commentator analyst Omar Badar, who specializes in the Middle East and has been watching things closely. Omar, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So 5 months into the conflict, and now we're in Ramadan. How, if in any way, do you expect things to change?
Yeah, it is unclear that things are going to change because the United States has not shown any appetite to apply real and meaningful pressure on Israel to change its behavior. President Biden has made clear his dissatisfaction with the track that Netanyahu has chosen so far, but he has promised that U.S. military funding for Israel is going to continue, that U.S. diplomatic protection for Israel is also going to continue. And that does not create an incentive for Israel to get off course, basically. And right now, they're still on this path of continuing to inflict as much damage and horror to the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza as possible in what can only be described as a campaign of vengeance rather than anything that is aimed at a clear and coherent political objective. And that's really the fundamental problem here.
Okay, well, let me touch on this thought that perhaps Ramadan was an opportunity to reach some sort of resolution, perhaps create some sort of ceasefire and get Israeli hostages returned to their families. To what degree was this a missed opportunity?
Yeah, look, I mean, Netanyahu does not care at all about Israeli hostages. If he did, he would not have engaged in this massive campaign of indiscriminate bombing that has actually killed many of them, and he would have made a sensible deal in which Hamas was willing to release all the hostages in exchange for a permanent ceasefire. But that is a non-starter for Netanyahu. He is bent on utterly devastating Gaza, on, to use his terms, thinning out the Palestinian population in Gaza as a way of changing the entire future of this dynamic between Israel and Palestinians. And that is his priority. So it is a missed opportunity in the sense that there is no political will to prioritize the issue of hostages within Israel in the current political climate and with Netanyahu at the top of this government. And that means that we are set on a path in which the hostages, it's very difficult to envision at this point a future in which you do come to a sensible agreement in which Palestinian hostages held in Israel get released in exchange for Israeli hostages. And we are on a path in which there's just going to be death and suffering for the foreseeable future until Israel decides to change course.
Well, you've commented you find it unbelievable that the US president would allow the Israeli prime minister to take things so far without, for example, cutting off military aid. What do you make of the back and forth recently where Joe Biden said at least that what Benjamin Netanyahu's doing is hurting Israel more than helping Israel? And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu saying Biden is wrong.
Yeah, look, President Biden is beginning to notice that this is having a negative political impact on his campaign, this unrestrained support for Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. We were watching literally hundreds of thousands of people being starved. In this case, like dozens of people starved to death in Gaza. That is utterly insane. It is morally indefensible. The American people do not support a policy that is this monstrous towards the civilian population. And we've had events here, particularly in Michigan, in which voters made clear that this is an issue that matters to them and that their support for President Biden hinges on him correcting course. And that is why we're beginning to see a little bit of harsher rhetoric coming out of President Biden about this issue. He just lacks the courage and the backbone to actually do something about it. He views the possibility of a major conflict between him and Netanyahu as also unpredictable in terms of its political consequences. And right now, he is being coy. He's choosing to ramp up the rhetoric very, very gradually and minimally in a way that, again, if you know anything about Netanyahu, you know that he's not going to respond to this kind of tepid criticism. And what you need is a heavier hand. Israel relies on U.S. military funding. If the U.S. were to cut off its weapons supply to Israel, Israel will be forced to halt the operation within days. And that is the only way you're going to change their behavior. This idea that you can appeal to Netanyahu's sense of reasonableness or policy goals or this or that, the man has no interest apart from his own political future and survival. And he's willing to inflict as much death and suffering on Palestinians and throw away the lives of the Israeli hostages in the process just for the sake of trying to save his own legacy. And that's not going to lead to anything better.
I'll get more onto that in a moment, Ahmad. But let me ask you, you just mentioned that, that Joe Biden doesn't have the backbone to take, firmer action. Would you see any US leader being able to challenge the situation with Israel?
I mean, we've had many leaders in the past who have challenged Israel meaningfully. Eisenhower forcing Israel to end its attack on Egypt. You've had Reagan with a phone call ending Israel's onslaught in Lebanon. You've had George H.W. Bush, the senior, who actually withheld some loan guarantees for Israel because of Israel's settlement expansion. But we've had this really upsetting cultural shift in the political culture shift in Washington, in which the idea that an American president can challenge Israel has disappeared. It's really a troubling political dynamic internally, where the Israel lobby mobilizes the majority of Congress against a sitting president if they dare cross Israel. And that's a very, very unhealthy domestic dynamic within the United States. It basically has us tied to the situation. And the only way we're going to break out of this is for a sitting president to basically decide that they're not going to care about the political turmoil that's going to come from challenging Israel, and to begin to center the interests that Biden claims to uphold, that he's the president whose administration is going to center human rights and diplomacy. Well, that, you should put your money where your mouth is. And if that means a conflict with the pro-Israel lobby and some members of Congress who are going to object to it, so be it. We can't constantly be on the wrong side of history. You can't have the United States supporting this scale of genocidal violence against civilians while at the same time claiming to preach human rights and international law. It simply does not go together. Okay. And you do need a president who will have the backbone to actually stand up to Israel once and for all.
Omar, you're giving me quotes of presidents who acted, well, more than a quarter of a century ago now. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu said he's planning to go with troops into Rafah. Joe Biden has said that's a red line. In reality, what do you make of that? Is that actually going to be in any way of significance to Benjamin Netanyahu? And what are the consequences if the troops do go in?
Yeah, you're putting your finger precisely on the problem. What does it mean for it to be a red line? What are the consequences of crossing a red line? If you can continue banking on US bankrolling your operation, providing you with arms, vetoing UN resolutions that are critical of Israel and calling for a ceasefire, intervening to put pressure on the International Criminal Court, opposing the International Court of Justice, investigating Israel for possible genocide, all of that is what should be at stake. Crossing a red line has to mean a meaningful shift in American policy and approach. And right now, Netanyahu, President Biden, in the most recent interview in which he was outlining that red line, said that he's never going to cut off military aid to Israel, never going to, quote unquote, abandon Israel. Well, if you're telegraphing from the beginning that no matter what Israel does, you're going to continue backing them, the red line is simply meaningless. I mean, it talks about increased tension between Netanyahu and Biden as personalities, but you have to push for the fundamental relationship, the nature of that relationship changing if Israel continues down a path in which, not, by the way, just this current onslaught in Gaza that is anticipated after Israel has squeezed Palestinians into Rafah to cause absolutely massive casualties. We've already seen massive casualties, and the idea of that merely being the tip of the iceberg is a really, really frightening prospect. But even beyond that, utter rejection of a Palestinian state, utter rejection of the idea of ending Israeli apartheid rule over Palestinians that denies them their freedom and their fundamental rights. All of that, as long as Israel's moving in that direction, there's simply no excuse for U.S. policy to continue as is. And that red line really has to mean something, and it can only mean something if we outline what those consequences are actually going to be.
Now, in your opinion, why has there been no progress in a long time on the release of the Israeli hostages? I know you say that Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't really care about them, but there is pressure from other areas in the Israeli public and government.
Yeah, it's about priorities. I mean, if you could just get the hostages released for nothing in exchange, I'm sure that they would be more than happy to accept a deal of that. But right now, Netanyahu is insisting that there is no future in which Hamas can survive in Gaza. And he's insisting in which there is no future in which Palestinians in Gaza can be free of Israeli control. And as long as that is your priority, hostages have to come second. And that's the deal, the problem that we're stuck in. There's been repeated efforts at reaching a deal in which Hamas releases all the hostages. And what's expected in return is an end to Israel's onslaught in Gaza. And all Netanyahu has offered is a 6-week pause. I mean, think of the lunacy of this. How does it make sense for Palestinians to accept a deal in which you stop slaughtering them for a temporary period of time, and then you continue the onslaught while Israel gets everything that it wants, the complete release of hostages, and leaving basically Hamas with no leverage at all? That simply makes no sense. Everybody who understands how political deals are made, they're made when each side gets to have something. That's how you actually reach a deal. And any policy, that any deal that is based and built on the idea that Israel's continued onslaught in Gaza is imminent, that any stop to it is only going to be temporary, is not obviously going to be a deal. It can't lead to anything better. And that is where you see where the Israeli government's priorities actually are. The hostages are absolutely secondary. Israeli soldiers have opened fire and killed their own hostages in Gaza, including ones that were unarmed, shirtless, and lifting white flags. If the operation was genuinely centered around releasing hostages, these kinds of mistakes would not have been made. But they make these mistakes because they are engaged in an onslaught, an indiscriminate onslaught in Gaza. And whether they're killing Palestinian civilians or Israeli hostages, it's simply secondary. The primary goal is to devastate Gaza to the greatest extent possible as a warning, so to speak, to kind of restore Israeli deterrence after October 7th. But we know that that actually is not working, as evident by what Hezbollah is doing up north. Israel is losing this politically, and in the meantime, the Palestinians are paying the heaviest price with their very lives because of this ongoing genocide.
Omar, I know you say that Benjamin Netanyahu is basically waging a war against the Palestinian people. He's got this goal of thinning out the population, as you've described. But surely now, with what's going on, the visibility through social media and everything else, the visibility of what's going on surely has to limit what he can do.
Yeah, there's always been this dynamic in which people have hoped that public pressure and that Israel's concern for public relations and how they look in the world would be a factor that weighs their decisions. But what we've seen systematically over the past couple of decades, really, is a further and further right-wing shift within the Israeli government, more and more overt racism towards Palestinians, in which public relations seems to really, play a secondary role in this government's calculations. That you've had the passage of laws that say that the right to self-determination is unique to Jewish people, very open discrimination. You have Israeli politicians who are convicted of anti-Palestinian terrorism and racism by Israeli courts, now holding up minister positions within this government. We have a shift in which Israel is becoming more and more emboldened to show its racism and disregard for Palestinian human life in public without fearing consequences. And that really all comes down to the fact that the only real leverage on Israel is U.S. military backing and diplomatic backing. And until that is threatened, I think Israel just simply does not care at the fact that the entire world is watching this massacre unfold before our eyes. The images of Palestinian children starving to death, littering social media, the images of children buried under the rubble, screaming for their parents. I mean, any country that has even, forget a moral sense, but even wanting to put on the pretense of being a moral country would have absolutely stopped this kind of onslaught a long, long time ago. It's quite clear that this is not where Israel's concern is. And the keys are in Biden's hands and in the hands of U.S. policymakers, who are the only ones who can impose real consequences on Israel beyond the possibility of this shifting into a wider regional war with really unpredictable consequences.
I've heard a lot of people say that it's not widely reported in the Western media, but that there is a fair amount of the Israeli public that is now losing faith in its leader. Benjamin Netanyahu's managed to stay at the top of Israeli politics for a very long time. But to what extent do you think he might have pushed it a bit too far and would have to step down?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps one can imagine a scenario in which they do invade Rafah, that there is much more significant international backlash, again, disappointingly not from the United States, but from the rest of the world, that creates a sense within Israel that clearly Netanyahu is not a fit leader, that he's doing incredible damage to Israel throughout the entire world. But again, it's unclear how great those numbers are. As I mentioned a second ago, we do have this significant shift in Israeli politics to the right, to where even though voices who are concerned about the hostages, particularly their families, and voices of people on the left who are just absolutely shocked with Israel's conduct, their voices are getting louder and louder. But in terms of what percentage of the population they form, the shift has been absolutely clear, that their numbers are actually dwindling, and that unlike places like the United States, where the younger generation is more progressive than their parents and more concerned about human rights and equality and is globally minded, the trend in Israel is the exact opposite, where younger people are more and more anti-Palestinian and more right-wing. And that does not bode well for Israel achieving a course correction on its own, which is why we need this external pressure from the International Court of Justice and from the international community to really get Israel to budge on its current policies. How
do you think, Omar, things might change under a different leader in Israel, Benny Gantz, for example? You've talked about hardline right-wing.
So you might get an immediate change in policy towards Gaza as an immediate situation, But the broader, we have to remember that the conflict existed long before this particular crisis, long before even Hamas came into existence. And so you need to deal with the fundamental driving force of this issue, which is the fact that Israel controls the lives of millions of Palestinians and denies them their freedom and their political rights and their human rights. And we've seen with Gantz and with many others, there doesn't seem to be appetite to fundamentally end Israeli apartheid. So they might put on a better face. They might commit smaller atrocities. They might, enact some easements on Palestinian movement from one place to another or whatever. But the fundamental reality of challenging Israeli apartheid at its core does not seem to be on the table across the political spectrum right now within Israel, barring a few very far left parties, the Palestinian members of the Israeli Knesset. This is where you have voices that are fundamentally calling for a shift in Israel's relationship with the Palestinians, but those are incredibly small. And so a change in leadership may ease some pressure off of Israel and put on a slightly better face to Israel's policies in the short term, but it will not fundamentally change the dynamic and it will not resolve the issue, because that will require an end to Israeli apartheid and for Israel to start seeing Palestinians as equal human beings who are deserving of the same freedom and dignity that Israelis enjoy. And we seem to be very, very far away from that right now.
You touched on it a little bit earlier, but the Arab American population hasn't had any real direct say in what's going on in Gaza, but they will have a say when it comes to the US presidential election. Now, of course, the candidates are trying to court as many areas of society as possible. What sort of impact do you think the Arab American population could really have on the election and who ends up in the White House?
Yeah, the Arab American population is pretty concentrated in swing states. Particularly Michigan is where the greatest Arab American population exists in the United States, is in Michigan, and that is a key state for this upcoming election. Now, of course, the problem is that the primary choices are Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And as horrific and horrible as Joe Biden's policies have been so far towards Palestinians and this embrace of Israel, there's every indication that Trump is just as bad, if not worse, on this issue and a wide range of other issues that impact the Palestinian American and Arab American community more broadly. So the community is stuck between a rock and a hard place. They do carry a lot of political weight, but the choices put forth by these parties right now, the major parties that have a chance at winning the presidency in this upcoming election, puts us in a very, very tough and complicated position. So it's unclear. I imagine that there's going to be a significant protest vote that takes the shape of either not voting or voting for a third party, people like Cornel West or Marianne Williamson, people that we know are not going to win the presidency, but may nonetheless be a way for our community to show that they are frustrated with this current dynamic. The consequences of that are uncertain. What policy continues, like whether we cost Joe Biden the election and what it means for Donald Trump to come in, these are all very, very dark and dangerous prospects that unfortunately it doesn't look like that's going to lead to a better outcome in the short term. But there is hope that the community can actually send a message and make its voice heard so that in the future, when these situations come up, certainly Democratic Party president candidates should not take for granted that they can get that vote and understand that this policy of unconditional backing for Israeli atrocities is something that is politically costly. And I think that there is an appetite to send that long-term message in spite of the short-term consequences of ending up with another fascist-leaning president like Donald Trump coming back to power.
Well, Omar, you answered my question about your views on a Trump presidency just there. Let me ask you about the situation with governance when it comes to the Palestinians themselves. We have the issue, of course, with Hamas seen in a dark light as far as the West is concerned, at least. What about Fatah? What about the creating a better unity among Palestinians? Because to a large degree, there are reports they feel let down overall by both sides.
Yeah. I mean, look, the problem with Fatah and the leadership that exists right now in Ramallah is that it basically has bent over backwards to accommodate every and all Israeli requests and demands for the way that they behave, the security coordination, that they end up not carrying any political leverage at all. You know, they have no chips in their hands they can trade for Israel changing its behavior. They're operating effectively, completely bending to whatever Israel wants. And when you lose that much leverage, you lose legitimacy among your own people as well. People have looked at the path that the current leadership in Ramallah has pursued of basically saying we can achieve a state by just giving Israel whatever they want, ensuring their security, playing ball, whatever demands they have to just accommodate them. And that's precisely why we ended up with support shifting towards, more extremist groups like Hamas that do have a militant path forward. Their vision is a militant one for how you can achieve Palestinian freedom. And, that's basically, if we actually want to diffuse current support for militant groups, you have to provide Palestinians with a path towards freedom that does not require it. And for Palestinians, it's been, whether it's negotiations that have led to nowhere because Israel was basically only pretending to be engaged in a peace process, whether it's a movement for boycotting Israel that has demonized the world over, whether it's peaceful protests that Israeli soldiers crush, whether it's going to the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court or the UN, where the US applies pressure to make sure there's no accountability for Israel. Every avenue that Palestinians have tried to pursue to achieve freedom has been shut in their face, which is precisely why we see this pull towards a different way of operating in which Palestinians are pursuing more militant routes. And you see greater support for militant organizations because every other path has been shut in their face. So for the international community that is interested in shoring up public support for organizations and political parties within Palestine that have a more peaceful and conciliatory approach, you can't get that. You can't get that unless there's a shift in Israeli behavior. And Israel is squeezed to react seriously to Palestinian overtures towards achieving some kind of peaceful compromise. But right now, the standard policy is Israel can do whatever it wants, steals whatever lands it wants, takes whatever water it wants, throws Palestinian children in military detention, many cases without charge or trial. The level of abuse that is just imposed on Palestinians with complete and total impunity. And then you come along and say, pick leaders who want to have a peaceful path with Israel forward is a non-starter. We have a dynamic in which, until there is meaningful pressure on Israel to change its behavior, I'm afraid it doesn't matter which party gains more political control or clout within the Palestinian territories.
So, Omar, it sounds like you're saying that the Palestinians don't really have anyone to turn to when it comes to leadership.
Well, I mean, there are people who are languishing in Israeli prisons. There is a figure by the name of Marwan Barghouti, who is likely to be very popular if he's ever allowed to run in Palestinian presidential election, especially with Mahmoud Abbas right now aging and his, not having much longevity probably in maintaining the presidency over Palestinians. That might potentially be a path forward. And you see an overture by Hamas, who are insisting that Barghouti be released from Israeli dungeons as part of the deal that they want to make over hostages with Israel. That is one figure that may potentially be a unifying force and may basically be the Palestinian Mandela, so to speak, somebody who has been convicted by Israel and thrown in prison for a very, very long time, but nonetheless, somebody who does command the respect of the society and who is serious about pursuing a different path forward. And if he is given legitimacy if he's allowed to actually run for the presidency, that might be someone that actually gets the support of many Palestinians of very, very different political factions, instead of being stuck in the current dynamic of eternal division.
Omar, let me turn to current issues again. And we sense there's now possible tensions over the right to worship at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Ramadan, of course, being a very important time for Muslims there. How do you see that situation develop? Because we've already seen Israeli forces restricting movement there, although the government has said they will allow people to worship as before.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it happen Ramadan after Ramadan, in which basically clashes and Israeli attacks on worshippers in Al-Aqsa, breaking into the mosque. These kinds of things are regular and ongoing even before this current crisis. So you can imagine, in a climate in which Israel is carrying out genocidal violence in Gaza, starving children to death and devastating the entire population, that is a situation that is more ripe for even greater confrontations in Jerusalem, which is where Israel's caution is coming in about what policies they want to pursue. But again, I mean, the entire premise of this is fundamentally aggravating in a way, because Israel has no right to rule East Jerusalem, which is where all these holy temples are. East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory that Israel has no right to whatsoever. And the idea that Israel gets to impose and choose which worshippers go in and which ones don't is just a travesty that the world puts up with it. These are occupied Palestinian territories that should be in the control of Palestinians, because the occupation itself is illegitimate and has no basis. The world at this point agrees collectively, entirely, that this occupation has to come to an immediate end and that there is no legitimacy to Israeli rule in East Jerusalem. And the fact that we just treat it as normal, that Israel rules East Jerusalem and gets to decide what Palestinians get to do and don't get to do, I think speaks to the embrace of the inequality that Israel has imposed especially when you see how it's reported on in the Western press, there's almost an acceptance to the idea that Israel is a legitimate dominant force that gets to rule Palestinian lives, but the opposite is never proposed or suggested. That we deal with Israel as legitimate authorities in East Jerusalem, I think, is itself ought to be a scandal.
Omar, considering how severe the humanitarian crisis is now in Gaza, what are your friends and any family there telling you about it?
Oh, it's absolutely devastating. I mean, we hear from people who have family there who talk about the fact that they can't even get a single clean drop of water in parts of North Gaza. It's absolutely horrific. We've imposed a situation in which Palestinians are utterly desperate for the most basic necessities of actually living. And you see these images littering social media of Palestinian children who have either starved to death or died of dehydration. It is utterly shocking that we live in an era in which something like this would be allowed to happen. We use the phrase never again, and we see images of starving people from many past atrocities, including the Holocaust. And we pretend that we live in a world in which something like this could never happen again. And yet we are witnessing what is happening in Gaza right now, where entire hundreds of thousands of people are desperate to get their hands on food and water in order to make it through life day by day. And it's all due to a deliberate policy of starving the Palestinian population that Israeli officials were quite open about. The Israeli defense minister said at the beginning of this crisis that he is going to cut off all food, all fuel, all water to Palestinians living in Gaza. And that is effectively what we're witnessing right now unfold before our eyes. And again, you have these efforts by the Biden administration to create this port. And all you would have to do to end this crisis is give Israel a serious warning and say, you have to stop starving the Palestinian population in Gaza, and you have to let those aid trucks in unhindered. That would solve the problem. And the idea that nobody's even dealing with the obvious way that you solve this problem, and instead doing all these extensive and elaborate military maneuvers to open up a port and dropping aid from the sky that ends up killing some people even, is utterly insane. We live in a world that is utterly insane, in which Israel gets to impose this kind of manufactured humanitarian catastrophe on an entire population, and we simply put up with it.
Omar, I'm going to just to wrap up, obviously many more questions to ask, but just a quick thought from you on how things might eventually end. All conflicts do have to end eventually. How is this going to end up for Hamas, for the people of Gaza, for the Israelis themselves? Just a quick thought.
I think, broadly speaking, there's probably one of two paths forward. Either eventually Israel understands that its campaign is not going to work out, that is squeezed by meaningful pressure into ending the current onslaught on Gaza and being forced to reach some kind of accommodation, or Israel is allowed to carry this all the way to the end, and they made clear their plans for effectively a massive ethnic cleansing of Palestinians out of Gaza. And if they do succeed at that, we are looking at the potential for regional destabilization. We are looking at the potential for the Hezbollah front in the north, on the border with Lebanon, exploding and getting completely out of control. We are looking at uncharted territory of what the future is going to look like. It is basically mayhem until the dust settles. And it's frankly very, very difficult to predict, to the extent that there is a future that can be one that can be viewed as a light at the end of this tunnel. It has to be real meaningful pressure on Israel to understand that its political goals are unachievable, and that this policy of simply massacring Palestinians is not going to lead to anything good, not even for Israel itself. And it's just an utter monstrosity and insanity that hurts everybody else in the process. And to start trying to deal with the underlying cause, which is that you cannot deny Palestinians freedom and expect for there to be a better future. You have to start allowing Palestinians to live in freedom, in dignity, and with human rights and with political rights on their own land. And that is going to be the path forward that actually brings security and safety to both Palestinians and Israelis.
Omar Badar, thank you so much. Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. Israel is starting to feel pressure from the USA to find some resolution to its conflict with Hamas as the situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate after 5 months since Hamas launched its attack on 7th of October. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made clear his intention for troops to enter Rafah, where Gaza's largely displaced population is now concentrated, and the situation there is being described as a humanitarian crisis. Meanwhile, there's still no sign of Israeli hostages coming home. All this leaves Mr. Netanyahu at something of a crossroads that could have implications for his political future. To discuss this and more, I'm joined from Tel Aviv by the spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister's office, Tal Heinrich. Val, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Riz.
Now, I've heard many journalists argue with you. Of course, they're going to, interrupt you and challenge you on many things. I want to do this a little differently. I want this to be, a proper discussion where I get to hear your points of view and get you to address some of the issues that are being discussed out in the public domain globally and now in the media quite often as well, so that we can actually get some idea on the issues that are being discussed out there. Often what happens with the questions and answers like this is it's easy to be rated as anti-Semitic when asking what Israel's policies are about. So I hope you'll grant me at least the freedom to just ask you, and no, I am not anti-Semitic, but I will ask you what is being said out there. Now, first and foremost—
Feel free to ask.
Thank you. First and foremost, there are more and more media reports of President Joe Biden seemingly losing his patience with Prime Minister Netanyahu and actually saying most recently that Prime Minister Netanyahu's approach is hurting Israel more than helping it. And I'm wondering how concerned is Prime Minister Netanyahu that US support is starting to show cracks?
So, Riz, we watched that interview, and I'm not sure exactly what the U.S. president meant there, because the policies that our war cabinet, it's not just the prime minister, as you know, we have a unity government right now in place, are promoting are policies that are overwhelmingly supported by the Israeli public. And we're talking about the goals of this war that we didn't start and didn't want as we defined them. We say that all hostages must come back home. We say that Hamas must be eliminated. And we say that Gaza can never, ever pose a terror threat to Israel again. And this is what we're after. We're seeking accountability, and it's a war of self-defense, because you know that Hamas leaders out there, they vow to carry out October 7th again and again and again. We all remember the scope and the unprecedented brutality of October 7th. And there's no taking chances here on our security.
I'll get on to some of those points you've raised in a moment, but Mr. Netanyahu, of course, responded by saying that President Biden was wrong. And in terms of, the accusation that perhaps the Prime Minister is following a personal agenda, quote, his response was private policies against the majority, the wish of the majority of Israelis, is wrong when President Biden says that, and that he's not hurting Israel more than helping it. But I wonder, how far do you think that Mr. Netanyahu believes things can go before perhaps the US starts to act in a more decisive way, perhaps even cutting military aid?
President Biden also addressed that issue, by the way, in that very same interview. And he said that it's not something that he would consider because the president is committed to Israel's security. I mean, full stop. And as much as sometimes, media outlets or online comments, bloggers and whatnot try to portray it as if there's a daylight between Jerusalem and Washington. It doesn't exist to the extent that people believe it is, because at the end of the day, we all want the same things that I just listed. But we also want to make sure Israel and Washington that on the way to achieving these goals of the war, we managed to safeguard Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and we managed to make sure that humanitarian aid will reach those who need it. So we all want the same things at the end of the day.
On that note, actually, it seems that getting humanitarian aid into Gaza to the people who need it the most is something of a challenge. And I wonder how Israel is responding to what's become something that has become, beyond what most people have seen in recent years.
So the challenge is, Riz, not to get the aid inside Gaza. The challenge is to get the aid around Gaza. And there, you're right. We say it. The United Nations say it. You see, we have been able to facilitate, I think right now it's more than 300,000 tons of humanitarian aid inside the Gaza Strip since October 7th. Just a few days ago, we have a record number of daily trucks coming in with food, 277. We have excess capacity on our side of the border to inspect these trucks. I think the number is about 44 trucks per hour. But the problem is that you have a backlog of humanitarian aid on the Gazan side of the border. And that is because the UN groups and agencies, international organizations, were reliant on Hamas to distribute the aid. And it's not just us saying it. It's also, there was an OCHA report. OCHA is the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs to Palestinians. And they said that back in February, for example, Israel scaled up the insertion of aid by 48% into Gaza. But they admit, and that's where the absurdity of the report is, that the challenge with distributing the aid is because of diminished presence of police, of Gazan police. But who are Gazan police? These are Hamas. That's the whole goal, to eliminate Hamas. So even the UN admitted by their own words that, their mechanism of distribution was somewhat reliant on Hamas. Now, it's a major problem. We acknowledge it. And this is why Israel is working with international aid, with international partners to better this aid distribution mechanism. This is how we came up with, the distribution by sea, the sea maritime corridor, and the airdrop of operations that we've had with, the Jordan, the UAE were involved, the United States, obviously, and other countries as well. I think France in the airdrop aid packages, and we're coming up with better ways, because we want to see at the end of the day this aid reaching the people who need it on the ground in Gaza.
Although there is a feeling, Tal, that that Israel and the military force, of course, there in Gaza has made it very hard for international agencies to do their job properly, and that's one of the big obstacles too.
Well, it's not Israel, it's Hamas, because their strategy, Riz. There's a war taking place there. We can't forget about it. It's an active battle zone, and it's not a clean battle zone as Israel would have wanted it to be, because that's the strategy of Hamas. They embedded themselves within and underneath the civilian population and civilian structures, and they are hijacking the aid. They're hoarding the aid. We can't have that happen. If you remember, in the beginning of the war, President Biden also said that if there's proof, if we know that Hamas is hijacking the aid will stop. That hasn't happened, because it has happened that Hamas has been stealing this aid. The UNRWA themselves admitted to it in a tweet, I think, back in the beginning of the war, in the first several weeks of the war, and then deleted that tweet. But the aid hasn't stopped because we want the aid to reach civilians. And it's not an easy policy, very widely supported, I would say, in Israel, because there's a challenge here. Remember, our hostages are still in Gaza, and you're talking about the insertion of aid, entry of aid into Gaza, which is an enemy zone, to civilians that after every terrorist attack against us, against Israelis after 9/11, we're handing out candies.
Now, regarding those hostages, Tal, can you give us any idea of the mood of the relatives and families and friends of those still being held? It's now 5 months on. Of course, that's a terribly long time for them. They must be anxious to see their loved ones back. How is that mood developing?
It's day 157 right now of the war. It's been a torture of mind, body, and soul for the hostages in Gaza and for their families. I can tell you, Riz, that I came back from London just 2 days ago, and I was taking part in some events with several hostages. And we're hearing hostages, who came back, I should say, in November, as part of the framework that we've had in place. And we're hearing horrendous accounts from them, really. One of the released hostages described her conversations with some of the young women still in the Hamas terror dungeons. And she said, we know for a fact that they are being sexually abused. And there's a UN report that just came out last week confirming this detail. She talked to them. They told her how they were forced by Hamas terrorists to take showers in front of them, touch them, and some other things that I won't describe on TV, but it's horrendous. We know that they're beating them up. They're being deprived of sleep, of medical care. Some of them lost limbs on October 7th. And they're being deprived of food and of oxygen. They were being held, one of the hostages that I personally spoke to, 40 meters deep below ground. And she said the Hamas terrorists themselves couldn't even stay there because of the lack of oxygen. So they had to go up to the surface to breathe. and they had to stay inside. They separated 3-year-old twins from their mother. It's unacceptable.
Now, of course, there's
and are still doing.
Sorry, Tal. Of course, there are arguments on both sides. There are reports of Palestinian women being sexually assaulted by Israeli forces in the West Bank, for example. But what I wanted to get at was with the hostages, why...
I'm not familiar with these reports, and I most certainly can't confirm them.
Okay,
if there's any wrongdoing on our behalf, of course, it will be investigated and should be investigated, but it's nothing that I'm familiar with.
Okay. Well, what's really at the core of the securing of the hostages release? Because of this time, there are those out there, you know, obviously in the public domain saying, well, this is an opportunity for Prime Minister, Netanyahu to be able to really take his action as far as he can. And of course, some people say it's to wipe out the Palestinian population in Gaza.
So regarding hostage release negotiations, let me just explain where things are standing right now. Obviously, our stolen people must come back home. There's no question about it. All of them, 134. We know that time has run up for 33 of them, and that the ones who are still alive are going through a living hell, so to say. We want to see all of them back, and we are pursuing both the diplomatic avenue, and we're exerting very heavy military pressure on Hamas on the ground, because we know that the only thing that works is the combination of these two things. That's what worked back in November, and we managed to get this framework in place, which saw the release of more than 100 hostages. We're still hoping to get another framework of this kind, and make no mistake, there are no good solutions here, right? Only trade-offs. We didn't want to be in this a very complex situation. But you see so far in the negotiations through international mediators, and you probably reported on this, Hamas has been presenting outlandish, delusional demands, as Prime Minister Netanyahu called them. And U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken referred to them as non-starters. And then just a few days ago, you heard President Biden saying that Israel has put forward a rational offer. So we will continue to do whatever we can to try to yield another agreement of this kind, which will see the release of more hostages, because time is running out.
So, could I get your perspective on what's been discussed quite a bit, and that is the idea of what is a proportionate response to what happened on October the 7th with the Hamas attacks in Israel. The scale of now, the proportion, if you like, is so great. The multiple of Palestinians, women and children killed especially, is so high. How do you determine what is a proportionate response?
First, I appreciate that you don't quote Hamas numbers, as other media outlets often do, because we take them with a huge grain of salt. We don't, take them at face value. Hamas reports, Hamas numbers, Hamas claims. Of course, we don't want to see any civilian casualty. We don't. If we could, it's a war that we didn't start and didn't want. And of course, collateral damage is awful. It's terrible. Every loss of civilian life, it's heartbreaking, especially when children are involved. And we don't want to see that. But that is the strategy of Hamas. The only ones who want to see civilian suffering and civilian casualties in Gaza are Hamas. And you know what? They openly say it. Their leaders, when you look at their interviews, they say that they want to sacrifice the civilians of Gaza for their sick goal of obliterating the one Jewish state in the world. Now, to your question about proportionality in an armed conflict, it's not tit for tat. It's not if 1,200 of our people were killed, butchered, raped on October 7th, and 253 more were abducted, we have to do the same. Proportionality in armed conflict means doing what it takes to achieve a legitimate military objective. And the objective of bringing our stolen people back home and eliminating Hamas so that Israelis and Palestinians will never, ever suffer from the rule again, that's a very, very legitimate objective, the most justified war one could imagine. Now, if we dive a bit deeper in our discussion, and I'll just say this, when you plan a military operation, of course you assess the collateral damage, but you also assess the counterfactual. And that is, what is the cost of keeping Hamas in power? What is the cost of keeping bin Laden alive? What is the cost of, having ISIS with a foothold to a territory of their own? Or what's the cost of no total victory on the Nazis in the Second World War? That's also something that you bring into account.
Well, I've heard you, quote that before. I mean, there are a number of arguments I could get into regarding that, but I want to just actually wind back a little bit to the number of the hostages, and you'll have to, sorry, on the death toll. You have to forgive me because I wanted to quote something that Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Defense Secretary, recently told the House Armed Services Committee, saying that more than 25,000 women and children had been killed in this conflict. And the Pentagon wound that back fairly quickly to say, well, he was actually quoting Hamas figures from the Gaza Health Ministry. But ironically, it's a figure that even Israeli intelligence has said that those figures are generally quite accurate, and they're figures quoted by senior Israeli officials too. So it seems a bit of a strange contradiction.
So let me talk about the Hamas casualties, the terrorist casualties that we have in Gaza. I think that's something that's important to highlight at this point of the war, 5 months into it, because it's an unprecedented progress that the IDF has been doing on the ground, has been achieving on the ground, especially when you compare our conduct with previous very complicated urban warfare operations or wars, like the one of the International Coalition to Defeat ISIS, for example. So, Riz, I can tell you that right now, Israel eliminated more than 13,000 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists. Now, on top of that, you have thousands who were apprehended, and you have thousands who were injured, many of them immobilized. So we have gotten to this point in which we've taken out the majority of Hamas's military capabilities. And on top of that, we destroyed more than 90% of their missile stockpiles and missile manufacturing capabilities. And took out 18 out of their 24 battalions. And circling back now to the casualty numbers in Gaza, which we don't really know. Everyone is quoting Hamas's numbers. As I said, this is not what we want to do here on air. But even if you consider Hamas's numbers, you should bring into account how many civilians in Gaza died because Hamas killed them directly. I mean, all of the casualties in Gaza, of course, are on Hamas. But we know that more than 2,000 Hamas missiles fell short, for example, inside the Gaza Strip. We know that Hamas shot people trying to evacuate in humanitarian corridors. So it's a complex big picture that you have there. But just to sum it up, I'll say this, that when you look at what the Israeli military has been achieving on the ground so far, and you compare it with what the International Coalition to Defeat ISIS has done in the Battle of Mosul, so to say, so we compare favorably in each and every one of the categories of, the facilitation of humanitarian aid, the civilian to combatant casualty ratio, and the scope and the pace in which we're taking out these terrorists. I think
one of the most common comments I hear outside among the general public, when they do comment on this, is they say that it's not really a comparable situation. There's no other conflict that could be compared with this, simply because the people of Gaza, of course, lived in a very different situation from those when you compare other conflicts. One thing that does come up quite often is the terminology, the way it's portrayed in the media. Mr. Biden, for example, said Prime Minister Netanyahu must, quote, pay more attention to the innocent lives being lost as a consequence of the actions taken in Gaza. And some time back, Antony Blinken even said that that the situation should be to minimize civilian casualties. Now, to the general public, terms like pay attention to and minimize come across as very insensitive to the reality of the civilian casualties that take place, which, of course, if you're saying that Israel has taken out so many fighters, Hamas fighters and people you call terrorists, does it warrant the collateral damage of women and children?
It is a war. Wars are an ugly thing. And since the dawn of history, there hasn't been a war without civilian casualties, I believe. It's sad. It's terrible. It's awful. We don't want to see that. The only ones who want to see that are Hamas. They want to see the images of civilians dying and suffering in Gaza. But at the same time, you have to remember that it's a war that Israel must fight. We didn't choose to fight this war. There was no war on October 6th, so to say. Yes, the conflict was in place when you had violence, you had missiles, but for far too long, we have lived next to a terrorist enclave. And after October 7th, we simply say no more because we faced and we are still facing an existential genocidal threat, and it's called Hamas. And it's not an option for us anymore. To live this way. We want to see a better horizon. We want to see a better horizon, but for a better future between us and our Palestinian neighbors. And we believe that once we take out Hamas as the governing power, as a military wing in the Gaza Strip, we will be able to see something different, hopefully.
Do you think, Tal, that Hamas can honestly be fully wiped out? I mean, I've spoken to Israeli officials who themselves say, well, you're right, we would end up creating 1,000 Hamases with what's going on now.
So based on historical examples, you didn't have to take out each and every Nazi to dismantle their whole, the entire regime and the whole ideology and have a much different Germany that is, an amazing international partner of the allies who fought it in World War II. So that is my answer to you. It's not that you have to take out exactly every Hamas terrorist. If you're asking me exactly what's my definition, how many people, how many Hamas terrorists is it okay that will remain in Gaza in the day after Hamas? But what we want to do, and we said it from day one of the war, is to make sure that by the end of this, they will not have a governing power and military capabilities, nor will they have the desire to ever hurt us as they did. And we hope that by doing it, the Palestinian civilians who, unfortunately, by their own polling that we're seeing also in Judea and Samaria, so-called the West Bank, or in the Gaza Strip, that have been supportive of the Hamas ideology, even if not their actions, although we've seen high support to their deeds as well. We hope that this ideology will begin to shatter and that we'll see de-radicalization of the Palestinian society. Because
could it happen while
we all want to see something better?
Yeah, but how can the ideology change while there is occupation, while talks have gone nowhere for so long? And in fact, obviously the argument for Hamas's rise to power is that the rest of the Palestinian authorities are doing nothing to promote their people's peace process. So the ideology seems to be embedded now.
It's the other way around. First, let's boil down the ideology and what it means. When they say they chant from the river to the sea, they really mean it. And Hamas charter, they call to kill every Jew and to wipe out Israel, of course. They never wanted a state next to Israel. They wanted a state instead of Israel, and that's not an option. They believe, and they educate their children in Gaza, that each and every one of them is a refugee until the state of Israel will cease to exist. And that they have a so-called right to return to the territory of Israel, a state that they do not recognize. How can you have a better future with this ideology, when children are being taught to glorify martyrs? It's an impossible situation right now.
Now,
the society in the day after Hamas will have to de-radicalize and understand that Israel is not some temporary entity, that Israel is here to stay. And the Jews have a right to live in their ancestral homeland next to Arab communities.
So, Tal, I think there are a lot of Palestinians who would argue, yes, they understand Israel is here to stay, that it's not necessarily a majority view. A lot of young people say that for them, the chant from the river to the sea is actually something that suggests that they, as people, will be free. Not, obviously, there are going to be the radicals who see it the way you described it. But surely the engagement, I mean, the situation now is creating so much hate and so much division that it's going to be very hard to remove any kind of sense that there is no future.
I'll have to go back to a World War II example right here because, the war has brought destruction on Germany. Civilians died in Germany. But at the end of the day, did they endorse the Nazis when it was over? No. Exactly the opposite. They blamed the Nazis.
But Germany was an invading power. It was a full military invading power. The situation here, it's not really a comparison, is it?
It's not apples to apples. You're right. There's no perfect comparison. Also, in terms of what the IDF has been dealing with, this challenge on the ground, we can't compare it with Mosul either because it's a much more complicated situation here. But you can't appease terrorists. I think that everyone understands that there must be a total victory of Israel here if we want to see a better future, not just in Israel, but also in the entire region. Maybe some of these Arab countries will not say it out publicly and loud and clear right now, but, terrorists around the world are watching right now. They're observing, they're taking notes, they're seeing what's happening on the ground. And if someone out there tries to tie Israel's hands, tries to, make sure that Israel will not achieve a total victory, it sends the wrong message to all the bad players out there. It incentivizes terrorism at the end of the day.
Tal, isn't one of the big dangers that quite often, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself portrays it this way often, it's pushed as a Jew versus Muslim conflict. It's essentially a land dispute. Isn't there a danger that this pulls in the wider Jewish community, the wider Muslim community, and it potentially makes it a much more dangerous and global conflict? Like you said, terrorists are watching, even if they have no particular agenda with Israel. Now it's becoming Muslim and Jew.
I don't think so, but you said a sentence that really jumped out to me. We shouldn't dismiss this as a land dispute, because if it was a land dispute, you and I know very well that it would have been solved because there were so many initiatives to try to solve it as a land dispute. It's not a land dispute. It's not. The Palestinians have rejected every peace initiative since 1937. And every time Israel has made more territorial concessions and gave them more economic incentives. And, every time it was answered with more bloodshed, more missiles, more buses exploding after the Oslo Accords, for instance, more suicide bombings. So there's a repeating pattern here. And so I wouldn't just say it's a land dispute, because it's something way more rooted than this. It's not about territory. They simply don't want us here.
My point is not to argue on every issue, of course, Tal, because it's important to get your perspective and everything. One thing that does worry me, and probably you as a journalist too, is there seem to be a record number of journalists killed proportionate to any conflict in Gaza right now. The Committee to Protect Journalists has been highlighting how dangerous it's become, and that there's a record number of journalists killed in proportion to most conflicts. Why is that?
So obviously, journalists are not being targeted in Gaza. Of course not. The only ones whom we're targeting, the only ones whom the IDF are targeting are Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists, and the terror infrastructure, of course, on the ground. If journalists were killed as part of collateral damage, well, that's very unfortunate, and it's terrible. Of course, it's awful, but it's part of a war. There's no targeting of journalists. But what I want to highlight, though, is that throughout the war, we have discovered that several journalists were holding positions with Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. There was one Al Jazeera journalist, I think, was shot. That was his last name, and he was involved in the Hamas drone array or something of this kind. I don't remember the exact title. You had two other so-called journalists who were involved with Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas operating a drone from inside a car, and we captured a computer of one such Al Jazeera journalist, and we saw the evidence that he was a journalist, but also held a position with Hamas. So how does it work? Same goes for doctors, for example. There was a hospital manager whom we arrested, and he admitted that 16 of the hospital staff, himself included, held positions with Hamas.
Now, of course, Hamas has the kind of social side as well as the military side. So, of course, it's difficult in the same way we had in Ireland, Sinn Féin and the IRA. There were two separate entities that were still bonded at the hip in so many ways. As we are almost out of time, and I have so many questions, I hope we get to speak again. But as we don't have much time, what are your views on what's going to happen now during Ramadan? Was it a lost opportunity to create, some sort of resolution, at least with some sort of ceasefire, some return of hostages? It's an important time, and perhaps it would have been a good opportunity.
So we said that we will allow more humanitarian pauses in the fighting for the release of more hostages. That was, the very essence of the agreement that we had back in November that saw the release of more than 100 hostages. But as I told you, Hamas so far presented very delusional demands. So we're not there right now. We wish Ramadan Kareem to all of our friends in the region. We have many friends in the region. And here in Israel, you know, we have freedom of worship and freedom of prayer, and Ramadan is celebrated across many Israeli towns and cities. And specifically, I can tell you that, of course, there's going to be a lot of focus on the Temple Mount. And we, in the first week of Ramadan, we made sure that the number of people allowed in to pray will be similar to what we saw in previous years. No change. Of course, we will have to assess safety concerns, public security concerns, and as we move on. But it's unfortunate that you have very radical elements out there that try to inflame this holy period of the year, and it's unfortunate that you and I even have to talk about it in these terms, because it's supposed to be all about festivities, a celebration of tradition. I love traditions and family.
Sadly,
and
I don't think it's the last time we'll get to talk.
It will all be calm.
To talk about it. But Thal, thank you so much for making the time for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Riz.